Okay, so get this. How does a court case that starts with one argument end up being decided on something totally different? And what happens when a court orders a couple to reunite and it all ends, well, non-reconciliation, but at a police station? This is the story of a legal puzzle that did exactly that. And in the process, it completely changed Indian law forever.
So, let's dive right in. The big question we're tackling here is pretty wild. Can you actually win a legal case on an argument you never even made? It sounds impossible, right? But as you're about to see, one couple's really difficult divorce forced India's Supreme Court to answer that exact question. And in doing so, they basically rewrote the rulebook. So, our story kicks off with what I'm calling a divorce puzzle. And that's because on the surface, it looks like a pretty straightforward case. But as we start to peel back the layers, it really challenges our whole idea of how justice is supposed to work. The case itself is known as Malathi Ravi versus B.V. Ravi. Now, this isn't just any old divorce case. It became a landmark Supreme Court decision. It had this huge ripple effect on Indian matrimonial law, especially when it comes to the concepts of cruelty and, what happens when false criminal complaints get thrown into the mix. But before we get bogged down in all the legal stuff, you gotta understand the human story here. So, let's take a look at how this marriage came apart at the seams.
So the story is about two doctors who got married back in 1994. 4 years later, in 98, their son was born. And the wife, Dr. Malathi Ravi, moved to her parents' house, which, is a pretty common custom in India after childbirth. But here's the thing. The separation just kept going. In 1999, she starts her postgraduate studies in a different city, a move her husband later said he was never even told about. So by 2001, they'd been living apart for years, and the husband finally filed for divorce.
The husband's entire case was built on one very specific legal idea. So what did the first court have to say? The whole thing hinged on one question. Was this desertion?
Now, let's just be super clear on what desertion actually means in the eyes of the law. It's not just about living in different houses. To prove desertion, you need two key ingredients. First, the physical act of leaving, and second, the intention to permanently end the marriage. And this has to happen without the other person's consent for at least 2 years straight. You have to prove both or you've got nothing. So here's the first twist. The family court looked at all the facts and basically said, nope, they ruled there was no desertion. And why? Because they couldn't find any proof that the wife intended to permanently walk away from the marriage. See, her moving for postpartum care and then for her studies, the court saw that as a justified reason to be away, not a final nail in the coffin. I mean, this really shows you where the court's head was at. Not only did they reject the divorce, they actually ordered the couple to get back together. It's a legal thing called restitution of conjugal rights. The wife had asked for it, and the court agreed. It honestly seemed like that was it, story over. But it wasn't, not even close. And this is where we get to the real turning point of the entire case. A shocking accusation that just changed everything. So, following that court order, in August of 2004, the wife actually did move back in with her husband, and for about 2 months, they lived together again. You'd think, hey, maybe this court-ordered thing might actually work out. Then, everything changed. Just 2 months into the supposed reunion, on October 17, 2004, the wife goes and files a criminal complaint, an FIR, against her husband, his mother, and his sister, accusing them of dowry harassment. Suddenly, this wasn't just a family dispute anymore, it was a criminal case. And the fallout from this was immediate, and it was brutal. The husband, who was an associate professor at a medical college, was arrested. He spent a day in police custody. His mother and sister had to rush to get anticipatory bail just to avoid being arrested themselves. For a respected academic family, the public humiliation was just immense and so damaging to their reputation. So that accusation, it became the brand new centerpiece of this whole legal battle. The husband appealed the family court's decision, and the entire conversation shifted away from desertion and towards a completely different idea: redefining cruelty. This slide just lays it out perfectly. It's like a tale of two different cases. The husband starts in the family court arguing desertion, and he loses. But by the time this whole thing gets to the Supreme Court, the argument has completely morphed into one about mental cruelty. And this time, he wins. The divorce is granted. So, how on earth did that happen? So, what exactly is mental cruelty in the eyes of the law? Well, unlike desertion, it's not about a specific timeline or a single action. It's about behavior that's so severe that it causes deep emotional pain, anguish, and just makes it impossible for one person to keep living with the other. And the really important part is, there's no fixed formula. It all depends on the specific facts of each individual case.
The Supreme Court looked at the entire messy history of this relationship, but they really zoomed in on that criminal complaint. They basically said that filing a dowry case, which by the way was later thrown out by the criminal court, right after you're supposed to be reconciling, that was the ultimate act of mental cruelty. In the court's eyes, it showed a vengeful disposition, not someone who actually wanted to save their marriage. But wait a minute, remember that puzzle from the beginning? The husband never officially argued mental cruelty, so how could the court grant a divorce on those grounds? Well, this is where a really unique power of the Indian Supreme Court comes into play, Article 142. You can almost think of it like a constitutional override button. It allows the court to do whatever it thinks is necessary for complete justice, even if that means bending the usual procedural rules. The court basically decided that after 13 long years of fighting, sending them back to square one would be its own kind of injustice.
So after all that, what was the final verdict, and what's the lasting legacy of this incredible, complicated case?
Along with granting the divorce, the court made sure to focus on the son's welfare. It ordered the husband to pay 25 lakh rupees, that's $2.5 million, for child maintenance. Now at the time, this was a pretty huge amount, and it really set a new standard for cases involving high-income professional families.
The impact of this one case is massive. It really established 3 key legal precedents. First, filing a false criminal complaint can absolutely be considered an act of mental cruelty enough to grant a divorce. Second, it confirmed the courts are allowed to look at things that happen after a case is filed to really understand what's going on in a relationship. And third, like we just saw, it totally raised the bar for child maintenance and families with professional incomes.
And that kind of brings us to our final thought here. The case of Malathi Ravi versus B.V. Ravi is just a masterclass in how courts sometimes have to be practical. It leads us with this really fundamental question. When the strict black and white rules of legal procedure clash with the much grayer idea of what's fair, which path should a court choose? This case gives us one very powerful, and you could say a very controversial answer.